There are lines a man draws in his life, lines that define who he is, what he stands for. For Arthur Art Vance, that line was the edge of his own front porch, 78 years on this earth. And for nearly 30 of them, his days had started the same way. The quiet hum of a coffee pot in the kitchen, the crisp unfolding of the American flag, and the slow, methodical raising of it on the pole mounted beside his front door. It wasn't just a routine, it was a ritual. The flag was old. It had seen sun and rain, joy and sorrow. It had been at half-mast for a wife he'd laid to rest, and at full-mast for 2 sons he'd sent off into the world. It was more than just cloth and dye. It was a testament, a silent promise that this small piece of the world, this house, this lawn, this life, was his, that it meant something. But Fairlawn Ridge wasn't the same neighborhood he'd moved into all those years ago. The friendly, mismatched houses had slowly been replaced, bought up, leveled, rebuilt into beige, sterile boxes with identical mailboxes and landscaping dictated by a committee run by a company, Aegis Property Management, and a company run by one man, Marcus Thorne. Art had seen the letters. He'd heard the pitches. Thorne was turning the neighborhood into a portfolio, and Art's well-loved, story-filled house was a stubborn outlier on a spreadsheet, an imperfection. Everyone else had folded one by one. They'd taken the offers that felt less like opportunities and more like warnings. But Art Vance was a United States Marine. He didn't bow to warnings. That morning, the air was warm, the coffee was strong, everything was as it should be, until it wasn't. A black SUV slid to the curb in front of his house. It didn't belong, it was too new, too aggressive. Its windows were so dark they drank the morning sun. 2 men got out. They weren't neighbors. They were made of cheap suits and cheaper smiles. Art watched them from his porch, his hand resting on the railing. He didn't move. The taller one, a man named Lynch, walked up the pathway. The other, a mountain of a man named Hobbs, stayed back near the sidewalk, arms crossed. A silent enforcer. "Mr. Vance," Lynch began, the smile not quite reaching his eyes. "A beautiful morning." Art just nodded. "What do you want?" The smile faltered. "Straight to business. I like that. Mr. Thorne has instructed us to present you with his final offer. It's very generous, enough to set you up anywhere you'd like." "I'm already where I'd like," Art said, his voice as steady as the oak tree in his yard. "This home isn't for sale. I've told Mr. Thorne that. I've told his lawyers that. Now I'm telling you." Lynch took another step closer, his tone changing. The fake friendliness evaporated, leaving something cold and hard behind. "I don't think you understand, old man. This isn't a negotiation anymore. Mr. Thorne is finishing his project. You're the last piece of the puzzle. Some ground you don't give up," Art said, his voice flat. He straightened up, the years falling away to reveal the shadow of the young Marine who'd fought on frozen hillsides half a world away. That was his final mistake. He showed them he wouldn't break. So they decided to break him. Lynch's hand shot out, grabbing Art's left forearm. The grip was like iron. Art, even at 78, reacted with pure instinct. He tried to pull away, to twist free. But Hobbs was suddenly there, moving with surprising speed, blocking his retreat. Then came the pressure, a deliberate wrenching motion, and then the sound, a wet, sickening crack that echoed in the quiet morning air. White-hot pain exploded from Art's arm, stealing his breath, blurring his vision. He staggered back, his legs giving out from under him, and collapsed onto the hard concrete of his porch. His left arm was bent at an angle it should never be. Through a haze of agony, he looked up. Lynch was looking down at him, his face impassive. He brushed a piece of lint from his sleeve. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion, "doesn't like being told no." They turned and walked away. The SUV door slammed shut. The engine purred to life, and the vehicle glided away down the street, disappearing around the corner, leaving Arthur Vance broken, alone, writhing on the ground beneath the flag he had raised with that very same arm just an hour before. But he wasn't entirely alone. Across the street, behind a curtain, a widow named Eleanor Gable was trembling, her hand pressed over her mouth to stifle a scream. Her other hand held her phone, its camera pointed directly at the scene. Her thumb, shaking but resolute, had pressed the small red circle. She was recording everything. Eleanor Gable's hands wouldn't stop shaking. The video on her phone played on a silent, horrifying loop. The black SUV. The two men. The sickening twist of Art's arm. She'd called 911, her voice a choked whisper. An ambulance was on its way. The police too. But she knew, deep in her gut, that a police report wouldn't be enough. Not for men like that. Not for a man like Marcus Thorne. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over a name she hadn't called in years. It was a number Art's late wife had given her, for emergencies only. "If anything ever happens to Art, and you can't get a hold of the boys," she had said, "you call this number. You call Cal." Eleanor pressed the button. 200 miles away, in a garage that smelled of grease, steel, and burnt coffee, Caleb "Cal" Vance answered the phone. He was elbow-deep in the engine of a vintage Harley, a wrench in his hand, his mind a quiet map of pistons and wiring. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions. He just listened to Eleanor's trembling voice describe what she had seen, what she had recorded. When she finished, there was a long pause. "Did you send the video to the police?" Cal asked. His voice was unnervingly calm, a low, steady baritone that held no hint of the storm gathering behind it. "Yes. Yes, I did," Eleanor stammered. "Good," Cal said. "Stay inside. Lock your doors. And thank you, Eleanor. You did the right thing." He ended the call. For a full minute, he didn't move. The wrench was still in his hand. His eyes were fixed on the chrome engine casing, but he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing his grandfather, a man who had taught him how to fish, how to stand up for himself, how to be a man whose bones were now broken because he refused to be pushed. The rage came, but not in the way most men experience it. It wasn't a hot, blinding flash. It was cold. It was methodical. It was the chilling calm of a hunter who has just spotted his prey. Cal had left the Army Rangers years ago, but some things, some training, you never leave behind. He wiped his hands on a rag, pulled out his phone, and opened a secure messaging app. He tapped a group chat named with a single unadorned word, Sentinels. His fingers moved with precision. The message was short, coded, understood by the handful of men who would receive it. Thorne crossed the line. Art is down, Fairlawn Ridge, silent protocol. He hit send. Then he walked to a steel locker in the corner of the garage, opened it, and pulled out a worn leather vest. On the back was a patch, a stoic iron-colored eagle clutching a bundle of arrows. The emblem of the Iron Sentinels. He wasn't just a biker. He was the president of a club built from ex-military, former cops, and blue-collar men who understood loyalty better than they understood fear. Men who were more than cousins. They were brothers. Forged in fire, bound by iron. The responses came within minutes, a series of single-word acknowledgments. Copy. En route. On my way. From a dusty office above a courtroom, a man named Elias Preacher Cole put down his law books. From a darkened server room, a tech genius named Leo Glitch Martinez logged out of a corporate network he wasn't supposed to be in. And from a construction site, a giant of a man named Mason Rhino Davies dropped his tools and walked off the job. The storm was gathering. An hour later, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, it arrived. It started as a low rumble in the distance, a sound that didn't belong in the manicured, whisper-quiet world of Fairlawn Ridge. The residents heard it from behind their closed doors. It grew louder, deeper, a rhythmic ground-shaking thunder. Then they appeared. One by one, a dozen motorcycles rolled through the ornate iron gates of the neighborhood. They moved not like a gang, but like a cavalry unit, in a tight, disciplined formation. No wild revving of engines, no shouting. Just the steady, powerful purr of finely tuned machines. Cal led the pack on his matte black Harley. Behind him, the Iron Sentinels followed, their faces set like stone, their eyes scanning everything. They were a stark contrast to the sterile perfection around them. Worn leather against pristine lawns, scuffed boots on immaculate pavement. Men who had seen the world. rolling into a place that tried to pretend the world didn't exist. They didn't go to Art's house, not yet. Instead, with hand signals from Cal, they fanned out. 2 bikes took up a silent watch at the entrance to the cul-de-sac. Another parked near the HOA clubhouse. Rhino, on his massive bike, simply stopped in the middle of the street, a silent, unmovable mountain of a man. They weren't breaking any laws. They were just present. An undeniable, unshakable presence that screamed a single message. This ground is under new management. Meanwhile, in a penthouse office miles away, Marcus Thorne watched it all on a bank of high-definition security monitors. He swirled a glass of expensive scotch in his hand, a smirk playing on his lips. He saw the bikes, the leather, the tattoos. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. Look at them, he chuckled to himself, leaning back in his leather chair. A bunch of washed-up middle-aged bikers playing tough guy. He took a slow sip of his drink. He believed he was untouchable, shielded by his money, his lawyers, and his connections. He believed he was watching a temper tantrum. He had no idea. He was watching the opening moves of a war, and he had just met his enemy. The front door to Art Vance's house opened and closed with a quiet click. The air inside was still, thick with the scent of antiseptic and old memories. Art was in his recliner, his left arm a stark white monument of plaster and gauze, resting on a pillow. His face was pale, etched with pain, but his eyes were clear. They followed Cal as he walked into the living room. Cal knelt beside the chair, his large frame seeming to shrink so he could look his grandfather in the eye. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" The answer was obvious. He didn't say, "I'm going to make them pay." That was a promise that needed no words. Instead, he just placed a hand on his grandfather's good shoulder, a silent transfer of strength, of resolve. "The boys are here," Art said, his voice a low rasp. "They're here," Cal confirmed. "This isn't a bar fight, son," Art cautioned, his gaze unwavering. "Thorne, he's a different kind of enemy. He doesn't fight with his fists." "I know," Cal said, his voice cold and certain, "and neither will we." He stood up. Preacher and Rhino had followed him inside, their presence filling the small room. They stood in silence, a war council waiting for its commander. "All right," Cal began, his voice low. "Here's the board. Thorne thinks we're just muscle. He expects noise. He expects a fight. We're going to give him silence, and we're going to give him a war on 3 fronts." He looked at Preacher. "Elias, I need a weapon, not a gun, something he won't see coming. I want you to tear his rulebook apart, page by page. Find a crack, find a loophole, find something we can use to drag him out into the light on our terms." Preacher nodded slowly, his mind already at work. "Consider it done." Cal then turned to Rhino, whose massive form seemed to absorb the very light in the room. "Mason, you and I have the ground game. The people out there, they're terrified. Thorne's power comes from that fear. We need to break it. We're going to go door to door. We're not going to intimidate. We're going to listen. We're going to offer protection. We're going to build an army out of the people he's spent years beating down." Rhino gave a single decisive nod. "And the third front?" Preacher asked. A slow, dangerous smile touched Cal's lips for the first time. "The third front is a ghost." Miles away, parked on a quiet side street with a clear view of the Aegis Property Management building, sat a nondescript plumbing van. Inside, there was no plumbing equipment. There were servers, monitors, and a tangle of cables that snaked around a man hunched over a glowing keyboard. Leo Glitch Martinez cracked his knuckles. For him, the digital world was more real than the physical one. Firewalls were just locked doors. Encryption was just a puzzle. And the secrets of men like Marcus Thorne were just breadcrumbs, left behind by arrogant minds who thought their digital fortresses were impenetrable. He wasn't a battering ram. He was a whisper, a ghost in the machine. His first target was simple, the company's internal server. He slipped past the outer defenses with an ease that would have terrified Thorne's IT department. He was inside. Now he began to hunt. He wasn't looking for one thing. He was looking for everything. He followed the money first. It was always about the money. He watched the flow of funds from the HOA's community accounts. And there it was, A trail of small, regular payments laundered through a series of shell corporations, all leading to a single destination, a private security firm with two names on its payroll, Lynch and Hobbs. Got you, Glitch thought. He downloaded the transaction records. That was the direct link. The proof that the two thugs weren't just rogue actors. They were hired muscle, paid for with the residents' own money. But he didn't stop there. He dug deeper, moving through the server like a phantom, accessing personnel files, internal memos, emails. And then he found the mother lode, an email from Thorne to Lynch sent the day before the attack. The subject line was simple: the Vance problem. The body of the email was even simpler. It's time to deliver the final message. Make it clear he can't stay. Make it memorable. Glitch took a screenshot, his heart pounding with a cold, triumphant rhythm. This was it. The smoking gun. The order, straight from the king himself. He encrypted the files and sent a single, two-word message to Cal's secure app. Checkmate initiated. Back at Art's house, Elias Preacher Cole was surrounded by paper. He'd gotten a copy of the Fairlawn Ridge HOA bylaws and covenants, a document hundreds of pages long, filled with dense, impenetrable legalese designed to confuse and intimidate. To Preacher, it was a battlefield map. He read for hours, his finger tracing line after line. He was looking for a weakness, a contradiction, a single misplaced comma that could be turned into a weapon. The others saw him as the calm, quiet one, the thinker. They were right. He knew that true power wasn't in breaking the rules, but in using them to break your enemy. And then, on page 147, section C, subsection 12, he found it, a small overlooked clause. It stated that a special emergency meeting of all homeowners could be convened, bypassing the authority of the board president, if a petition was signed by just 15% of the residents. Thorne had written these rules to give himself absolute power. But in his arrogance, he had left behind a self-destruct mechanism, a democratic failsafe he never dreamed anyone would have the courage to use. Preacher stood up and walked over to Cal. "I have our weapon," he said, pointing to the clause. "He can't refuse this. He can't hide from it. We can force him into a room with every person he's ever bullied, and we can do it legally." The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the perfect lawns. Cal and Rhino began their walk. The first few doors were a testament to Thorne's reign of terror. Curtains twitched, but no one answered. One man spoke through the doorbell camera, his voice shaking. "Please, just go away. I have a family." They didn't push. They just moved to the next house. It was at Eleanor Gable's house that the tide began to turn. She opened the door without hesitation, her eyes finding Cal's. "He's a good man, your grandfather," she said simply. "Yes, he is," Cal replied. "Eleanor, we have a plan, but we need help. We need the people of this neighborhood to stand with us." He explained Preacher's discovery. He told her about the petition. He wasn't asking her to fight. He was asking her to sign a piece of paper. She looked past him, at Rhino's towering, silent form, standing guard on the sidewalk. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the street, a silent promise of protection. "For years," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper, "we've all been so afraid. Afraid of fines for the wrong color flowers. Afraid of letters for putting the trash out too early. He made us afraid of each other." She looked at Cal again, and something in her eyes hardened, a flicker of the same defiance that burned in Art Vance. "Give me the pen," she said. Her signature was the first. They went from house to house after that. They showed the residents the video Eleanor had taken. They told them about the petition. They didn't make promises of victory. They just offered a chance to stand up. Slowly, painfully, the fear began to crack. A young couple, threatened with foreclosure over a satellite dish, signed. An old man, fined for a small oil stain on his own driveway, signed. A mother, cited because her children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk were unauthorized decorations, signed with a vengeance. Each signature was a small act of rebellion, a quiet declaration of war. By the time night fell, Cal held a clipboard with 27 names. More than enough. He stood under a streetlight, looking at the list. He had the legal weapon. He had the digital ammunition. And now, he had an army. He knew what was coming next. He had poked the hornet's nest. And now, he waited for the swarm. Marcus Thorne was not a man accustomed to losing control. His world was built on a foundation of leverage, intimidation, and the quiet, crushing weight of money. He didn't have opponents, he had obstacles. And obstacles could always be removed. But as he stared at the email from his legal team, a cold knot of fury tightened in his stomach. A petition, an emergency meeting, convened by the very people he considered little more than pawns on his personal chessboard. He slammed his fist on the polished mahogany of his desk. The illusion of the calm, untouchable businessman was gone. In its place was a cornered predator. He knew who was behind this. The old man's grandson, the bikers. They hadn't come in swinging. They had come in smart. They had burrowed into the foundations of his power, turning his own rules and his own people against him. And he knew where it all started. It started with a phone call, with a video, with one old woman who had dared to look out her window. He snatched his phone and dialed a number. Lynch answered on the first ring. "There's a woman," Thorne snarled, his voice a low growl. "Eleanor Gable. She lives across from the Vance house. She's the one who recorded you. She has the original video on her phone. I want that phone. I want it erased. I don't care how you do it. Just get it. Now." There was a pause on the other end. "That's risky, boss. The bikers are everywhere." "They're bikers, not SEAL Team 6, Thorne roared. "They're expecting a fist fight. They're not expecting you to go after a little old lady. Get it done. Or the only thing you'll be getting from me is a one-way ticket to a federal prison cell. Do you understand me?" The line went silent for a moment. Then, a quiet, resigned voice. "We understand." Thorne hung up, his breathing heavy. The chess match was over. It was time to flip the board. Eleanor Gable felt it before she saw it. A prickling on the back of her neck. The feeling of being watched. She was driving home from the grocery store, her small sedan feeling particularly fragile on the wide suburban streets. She'd felt a surge of courage after signing the petition, after seeing the quiet strength in Cal Vance's eyes. But courage is a funny thing. It comes in waves, and right now, the tide was going out. She glanced in her rearview mirror, and her heart stopped. It was there, the black SUV. 2 cars back, moving with a predatory patience. She told herself it was a coincidence. It had to be. But her hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. She made a right turn onto a street she didn't need to take. The SUV made the same right turn. The coincidence was gone. All that was left was fear, cold and sharp. She pressed her foot on the accelerator, her mind racing. She was only a few blocks from home, from the safety of the cul-de-sac where the sentinels stood guard. She just had to make it. The SUV's engine roared. It pulled into the oncoming lane, effortlessly closing the distance. It was beside her now, a black wall of steel boxing her in. She could see Lynch in the passenger seat, his face a grim mask. He held up his phone, then made a gesture. "Give it to us." Eleanor shook her head, tears of terror welling in her eyes. That's when the SUV swerved, its heavy bumper slamming into the side of her small car with a screech of tortured metal. Her sedan fishtailed wildly, the steering wheel ripped from her grasp. She was heading for a row of parked cars, helpless. She closed her eyes, bracing for the impact. But it never came. Instead, she heard a new sound, a sound that cut through her fear like a thunderclap. The deep, earth-shaking roar of 2 Harley-Davidsons. She opened her eyes. On her left, a massive figure on an even more massive bike had materialized as if from thin air. It was Mason Rhino Davies. He pulled his bike parallel to the SUV, his sheer size creating a physical barrier. He wasn't even looking at Lynch. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his expression one of absolute, unshakable focus. On her right, another sentinel had boxed in the SUV from the other side. They had appeared from nowhere, a guardian angel escort made of leather and steel. Lynch screamed at his driver, Hobbs, to push them off the road. The SUV swerved again, trying to ram Rhino's bike, but it was like trying to move a mountain. Rhino's bike didn't budge an inch. He absorbed the impact, his skill and the weight of his machine holding the line. They had a new problem. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. Rhino guided the SUV, forcing it down a side street, away from Eleanor. He and his wingman herded the vehicle with the precision of sheepdogs, bringing it to a stop in a dead-end court. Lynch and Hobbs scrambled out of the SUV, their faces pale with a mixture of anger and fear. Rhino dismounted, followed by the other two sentinels. They didn't run, they walked, slowly, deliberately. They formed a silent, unmovable wall in front of the two thugs. Rhino was in the center, his shadow seeming to cover everything. He didn't say a word. He just stood there. And in that silence, Lynch and Hobbs understood something fundamental. They had brought a crowbar to a gunfight, and they had just run out of bullets. With a curse, they jumped back into their vehicle, reversed violently, and sped away. Rhino watched them go. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Back at Art's house, Cal was staring out the window when his phone buzzed. It was Rhino. Cal listened, his expression hardening with every word. He heard about the chase. He heard about the attempt on Eleanor. When the call ended, he stood motionless for a long time. The strategic calm he had maintained until now finally broke, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He had tried to play by a set of rules. He had given Thorne a chance to retreat, to surrender. But Thorne had responded by trying to harm a defenseless woman. He had tried to silence a witness. He had declared that there were no more rules. Cal turned to Preacher. "The meeting is tomorrow night," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Send the official notice, to Thorne, to the residents, to the press." He paused, his eyes like chips of ice. "This game is over. It's time to burn his kingdom to the ground." The community clubhouse at Fairlawn Ridge had never felt like this before. For years it had been a place of sterile silence, a room for hollow meetings where residents were talked down to, their concerns dismissed with condescending smiles and references to obscure bylaws. It was a room built to project power, Thorne's power. But tonight, the power had shifted. The air was thick, charged with a mixture of fear and something new, something dangerous. Defiance. Nearly every homeowner was there, packed into the room, their faces a mosaic of anxiety and grim resolve. They sat on folding chairs, stood along the walls, a silent, unified body. In the front row, Eleanor Gable sat straight-backed, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She was no longer the trembling woman behind the curtain. She was a witness. Dispersed among them, silent and watchful, were the Iron Sentinels. They weren't wearing their vests tonight. They were dressed in plain clothes, looking like ordinary fathers, brothers, and sons. But their presence was anything but ordinary. They were pillars of calm in a sea of tension. They didn't watch the crowd. They watched the door. The door swung open at precisely 7 o'clock. Marcus Thorne strode in as if he owned the very air they were breathing. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most of their cars, flanked by 2 sharp-faced lawyers clutching leather briefcases. He didn't look at the residents. He scanned the room with an air of supreme annoyance, as if their gathering was nothing more than a pest he had to exterminate before getting on with his evening. His eyes fell on Cal, who stood alone on the small stage at the front of the room, next to a projector screen. Thorne's lips curled into a smirk. "Well, well," he said, his voice booming with false confidence. "The ringleader of the circus." He turned to the crowd. "I'm not sure what this gathering is supposed to accomplish. This is an unsanctioned meeting, a violation of Article 7, Section 4 of the community bylaws. Therefore, it is illegitimate, and any discussion held here is null and void. You are all instructed to disperse immediately." A nervous murmur went through the crowd. This was the Thorne they knew, the bully with the rulebook. But Cal didn't flinch. He just stood there, waiting, letting the silence stretch. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Thorne," Cal said finally, his voice calm and clear, easily carrying across the room without a microphone. "This isn't a discussion." He held up a small remote. "It's a presentation." He clicked a button. The projector screen behind him flickered to life. The first image was a still shot of Art Vance's front porch. Then, it began to move. The room was utterly silent as they watched the video Eleanor had taken. They saw the black SUV. They saw Lynch and Hobbs approach Art. They heard the cold, dismissive words. And then they saw it. The grab, the struggle, the sickening, unnatural twist of Art's arm. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Some people cried out. Others covered their mouths, their eyes wide with horror. They hadn't just heard about it. Now they had seen it. The raw, undeniable brutality of it. Thorne's face tightened. His lawyers began whispering furiously to him. "This is inadmissible, a violation of privacy," one of them started to say. "We're not in a courtroom," Cal said, his eyes locked on Thorne. "Not yet. That was the why. Why we're all here tonight. Because you sent your thugs to break a 78-year-old man for refusing to sell his home." "I did no such thing," Thorne blustered. "These men were independent contractors." "Were they?" Cal asked softly. He clicked the remote again. The video disappeared, replaced by something else. A complex flowchart. At the top was a box labeled Fairlawn Ridge HOA Community Fund. Arrows snaked down from it through a series of numbered shell companies and ended in two boxes at the bottom. One read Lynch, D, the other Hobbs, M. Next to them were transaction dates and amounts, regular monthly payments. "This," Cal said, gesturing to the screen, "is your bank. Or rather, our bank. The money you've been collecting from every person in this room. And this is where it's been going. Not to community maintenance, not to landscaping. It's been going into the pockets of the two men who assaulted my grandfather." The murmur in the crowd grew louder, angrier. It was one thing to see the violence. It was another to know they had paid for it. "This is fabricated," one of the lawyers shouted. Cal ignored him. He looked at the back of the room, where Leo Glitch Martinez was sitting at a small table with a laptop. Glitch gave a subtle nod. "My associate is a bit of a records enthusiast," Cal continued. "He found your private server to be surprisingly welcoming. He also found this." He clicked the remote. An email appeared on the screen. The font was large enough for everyone to read. From mthorne@aegiscorp.net to lynched@securitas.priv. Subject, the Vance problem. Body, it's time to deliver the final message. Make it clear he can't stay. Make it memorable. The room fell dead silent. It was there, in black and white, the order. Thorne's face, which had been red with anger, was now draining of color. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a twitching nerve near his eye. He was starting to understand. This wasn't a temper tantrum. This was an execution. "But it was never just about my grandfather, was it?" Cal went on, his voice relentless. "He was just the last one holding out. The last stubborn nail that needed to be hammered down. The real question is, why? Why go to all this trouble?" He clicked the remote again. A new image filled the screen. It was a detailed architectural rendering, a sleek modern complex of glass and steel towers, a massive swimming pool, and a golf course. Underneath it, in elegant script, were the words, "The Thorne Estates at Fairlawn Ridge." Next to it, a zoning application, filed with the county months ago, requesting to have the entire neighborhood rezoned for high-density commercial and residential use. "This," Cal said, his voice ringing with cold fury, "is your endgame. This is why you've been harassing people for years. The fines, the threats, the intimidation. It was all designed to drive people out, to lower property values so you could swoop in, buy up their homes for pennies on the dollar, and build your own private kingdom on the ashes of their lives." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for everyone in the room. The years of petty tyranny suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. They weren't just residents to him. They were squatters on his future fortune. Thorne was breathing heavily now, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape. He saw only hostile faces, staring at him with a newfound burning hatred. His lawyers were pale, shuffling their papers uselessly. There was no bylaw to protect him from this. "You have no proof," Thorne whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's all circumstantial." "Proof?" Cal asked. "You want proof?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't connect it to the projector. He just held it up. "After your men tried to run Ms. Gable off the road last night," he said, his eyes boring into Thorne's, "I realized you were desperate. And desperate men make mistakes. They make phone calls they shouldn't make. For instance, A call to a certain city planning official you've had on your payroll. A call to make sure any police report about last night's incident got buried. Cal pressed a button on his phone. A voice filled the room. It was Thorne's voice, amplified, clear, and dripping with panicked rage. I don't care what you have to do. Bury it. The old woman, the bikers, all of it. If that video gets out, we're both finished. I've paid you too much money for you to let this fall apart now. A second voice, nervous and tinny, replied, Marcus, it's too hot. The state police might get involved. Then you handle them, Thorne's voice screamed from the phone. That's what I pay you for. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Thorne stood frozen, his face the color of ash. He looked like a man who had just watched his own ghost walk through the wall. He had been so careful, so insulated by his wealth and power, and in one moment it had all been stripped away by his own words. It was in that perfect damning silence that the clubhouse doors opened again. But this time, it wasn't Thorne's lawyers. It was 4 men in dark blue windbreakers with the words State Police emblazoned in bold yellow letters on the back. They moved with a quiet, professional efficiency that made Thorne's hired thugs look like clumsy children. The lead officer held up a badge, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Thorne. Marcus Thorne, the officer said, his voice calm and authoritative, leaving no room for argument. You are under arrest for conspiracy, aggravated assault, witness tampering, and bribery of a public official. Thorne's jaw worked, but no sound came out. One of his lawyers stepped forward. My client will not be answering any... Your client is coming with us, the officer said, cutting him off. Now! 2 officers moved forward. They turned Thorne around, pulled his arms behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent room. It was the most beautiful sound the residents of Fairlawn Ridge had ever heard. As they led him away, a broken, defeated man, Cal's eyes met his grandfather's across the room. Art Vance slowly, painfully got to his feet. He couldn't clap, but he gave his grandson a single, proud nod. The kingdom had fallen. The king was in chains. Checkmate. For a long moment after the police led Marcus Thorne away, the clubhouse remained perfectly still. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector fan. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, unable to fully believe that the long, quiet war was actually over. Then, from the back of the room, someone started to clap. It was a slow, solitary sound. Then another person joined in. And another. Within seconds, the room erupted. It wasn't just applause, it was a release. Years of pent-up fear, frustration, and quiet humiliation poured out in a wave of cheers, whistles, and tearful laughter. People were hugging their neighbors, strangers they hadn't spoken to in a decade. The reign of terror was over. The king had fallen, and his kingdom, built on paper threats and quiet intimidation, had crumbled to dust. The weeks that followed were a blur of headlines and legal proceedings. The case against Thorne was airtight. The digital evidence from Glitch, the audio recording, and the testimony of nearly 24 residents painted a picture of systemic corruption so clear it was undeniable. The city official was disgraced. Aegis Property Management was dissolved, its assets frozen. Lynch and Hobbs, facing a mountain of charges, turned on their former boss in exchange for lighter sentences. The machine that had tormented Fairlawn Ridge had been completely dismantled. But the real changes weren't happening in a courtroom. They were happening on the sidewalks and lawns of the neighborhood itself. 2 weeks after the arrest, the cul-de-sac looked like a different world. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of music drifting from open windows and the laughter of children drawing freely on the pavement. Tables lined the street, groaning under the weight of potluck dishes, hot dogs, potato salad, homemade cookies. It was a block party, a celebration of liberation. Art Vance sat in a comfortable lawn chair, a gift from his neighbors, his cast now decorated with the crayon signatures of all the neighborhood kids. He watched as Rhino, the giant of a man who had seemed so intimidating, patiently let a little girl braid a daisy chain around his thick wrist. He saw Preacher engaged in a friendly debate over chess with one of the men who had been too afraid to open his door just weeks before. The fear was gone. In its place, something new was growing: community. A microphone had been set up on the back of a pickup truck. One by one, residents stood up, not to complain, but to share. They told stories of the small kindnesses they had seen, of the relief they felt. Finally, they called for Art. With Cal's help, Art walked to the truck. He stood before his neighbors, not as a victim, but as the quiet anchor around which they had all rallied. The crowd fell silent. "I'm not much for speeches," Art began, his voice steady. "For a long time, this place felt quiet, too quiet. We were all neighbors, but we were strangers. We let rules and regulations build walls between us. What happened to me, it was wrong. But the worst part wasn't the broken bone. It was the feeling that I was alone." He paused, looking out at the faces before him, his friends, his community. "You all proved me wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You reminded me that the strength of a neighborhood isn't in its matching mailboxes or perfect lawns. It's in its people, looking out for one another. Don't ever forget that again." He didn't need to say more. They understood. Later, as dusk began to paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Cal and Art sat on the front porch, just as they had on the first day. The sounds of the party were softer now, a gentle murmur in the evening air. They sat in comfortable silence for a long while. "You know," Art said finally, his eyes on the horizon, "when you were a kid, you had this fire in you, a wild streak. I used to worry about it, worried it would get you into trouble." He turned his head, a slow smile spreading across his tired face. "I'm proud of you, Cal, not for the fight, but for knowing why it was worth fighting." Cal looked at his grandfather, the man who had taught him what it meant to hold your ground. He saw the strength that had never wavered, the quiet dignity that had started it all. "You drew the line, Grandpa," Cal said softly. "We just made sure nobody crossed it again." They sat together as night fell, the first stars beginning to appear in the deep blue sky. A light breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree, and from down the street, the sound of laughter echoed. It was the sound of a neighborhood that was healing, a neighborhood that was free. The war was over. The Iron Sentinels had ridden away, their job done. But on a quiet street in Fairlawn Ridge, beneath a flag flying at full mast, a new watch had begun. One kept not by bikers or soldiers, but by neighbors. And this time, they were all standing guard, together.